Good day. Welcome back to our study through the book of Proverbs. For those of you that are watching by video, you're going to notice in the next few videos I'm going to be wearing the same clothes. It's not that I'm wearing the same clothes day after day. I've gone several days not having a Proverbs video because at the time of the taping of these, we are currently navigating the coronavirus quarantine. And so I've been caught up in that. I've not been able to devote the time to this study that I really should have. Didn't want to do it halfway, so I'm going to try to catch up today and get some good content in here. This is going to be the 15th edition of our study through the book of Proverbs, which means that we are in the 15th chapter of this book. In the 15th chapter of this book, it opens up in the first 4 verses with a few verses relating to control of the tongue, which we've seen this in previous chapters. The idea that the tongue is very important. We've talked about this, how that the tongue is the rudder of the ship, and it's also the bridle of the horse, and all of this. We've talked about these allusions in the New Testament to how important the tongue is in keeping a holy person. But what this goes into is a little deeper, how that it directly influences and impacts your life. So we want to read verses 1, 2, and 4, and we're actually going to come back and talk about verse 3 in a moment. Number 1, a soft answer turns away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. The tongue of the wise uses knowledge aright, but the mouth of fools pours out foolishness. Verse 4. A wholesome tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness therein is a breach in the spirit. And so verse 1, it compares these two types of tongues, a soft answer or a grievous tongue, a soft answer or grievous words. And that phrase, grievous words, can also be translated rightly as words of pain. These are just words that hurt people. And I want to pull out my whiteboard again as I hit everything on the way up. When you're having a discussion with someone and they're maybe contending for a point that you don't agree with, this is a debate, and you may even call it an argument. And arguments aren't in themselves wicked or evil things. They're not sinful to have. Debates are good. This is how that we've pretty well discovered what's true and what's false throughout human history. But when somebody makes a point that it's a good point and you disagree with the conclusion, what you do often, and this is a human thing, it's natural, is you just start to do what's called an ad hominem. And maybe you can read my horrible penmanship here. Ad hominem. Ad hominem literally means at the person. So what you do is you say, in your mind, you say, well, that was a really good point, and I don't have a way of debating it. I don't have a way of proving that it's false. So I'm just going to attack the person that made the argument instead of attacking the argument themselves. So, for instance, somebody who is somebody who's in favor of free contraceptives might make the point that in cases like what we saw in Denver, where they made contraceptives free when they legalized marijuana, the abortion rates plummeted and went way down. And so the person actually makes a point that most of the opposition would be in favor of. They would say, well, you may not be in favor of premarital sex, but I know you're against abortion, and when we give free contraceptives, the rates of abortion go down. And you might say, well, that's a pretty good point. And you don't have any way of debating that, so you just start spewing out vitriol on the person that made it. Well, you're just saying that because you did this, or you're just saying that because you believe in this. And it's all on the person. And you see this in politics all the time. They call it mudslinging or mud throwing. You see the ads, this message was approved by so-and-so, and then it's got somebody doing some wicked thing. And they're not talking about what they believe, they're just talking about them. Well, that sort of thing is all talked about here in Proverbs 15:1. A soft answer will turn away wrath. To give an answer that makes sense and that is trying to console and bring people together will actually help. But grievous words, painful words, words that are meant to hurt people just stir up strife and anger. Okay, they just cause more problems. They don't help. One man said, I don't like to throw mud because 2 things happen. You get your own hands dirty and you lose a lot of ground. And I like that a lot. I've always thought that that was a very good way of putting that. So remember that ad hominem, this is called a fallacy, which means that it's not a good way of making a point. And I think everybody knows that. But we do it just naturally because we get angry. We get angry in the moment. We just don't like what's going on, and so we just start spewing out hatred. Now, verse 2, the tongue of the wise uses knowledge rightly. This shows deliberation. This shows some time that's taken. And look at the opposite there. Fools pour out foolishness. And a lot of times we call this word vomit. This is something that it takes some deliberation to actually think about what you're going to say. And one thing that we found is that for the most part, when we're talking to somebody, or we think that somebody is expecting a response from us, we take about a third as long as we would actually expect somebody to take to give an answer. What that means is when somebody asks us a question, we don't use the time that they think we should have. So, we think that we should have an answer in 3 seconds, because 3 seconds of silence is a long time to be waiting. Let's take that. Now, if somebody asked you a question and you sat in silence that long before speaking, you would feel like that took you a long time. But really, an average person, when they ask a question, are willing to wait up to 9 seconds for an answer. But we try to do it in 3. We just spew out an answer, even if we haven't really thought about it. And the Bible tells us here, the tongue of the wise uses knowledge rightly. It's deliberate. You take a moment to think about what you're about to say. And this is more, it's less word vomit and more close to what we call laconic phrases. Laconic phrases comes from Sparta. The Spartans were very, well, they were brutish for one, but we know them for their military might and prowess. But one of the things that they were really good at was they were very, very conservative in everything, including their language. They didn't like to use words unnecessarily. And so what they would often do is they would send these letters or words of some sort of communication, and they'd be very short, and they just got the point across. So for instance, when Alexander the Great, his father, Philip of Macedon, was conquering through Greece, he comes to the end of Greece, and he looks over and he sees Sparta, which is an island, and he sends a messenger across, and he says, should I come over as a friend or an enemy? Because he had conquered all of Greece to this point, and Sparta was all that was left. Should I come over as a friend or an enemy? And the Spartans simply sent back, neither. And so Philip of Macedon sends across another messenger, and he says, if I come across as an enemy, I'm going to kill all the men, and I'm going to take all the women as slaves, and I'm going to put your children into our army, and they're going to fight against other nations and probably die, not even fighting for Sparta. And the Spartans sent back, if. This laconic phraseology, just using very short words to tell a very simple message. And this is the sort of thing that the Bible is talking about. Just use your tongue wisely, use the knowledge that you have, and be deliberate with what you're saying. That's what a wise person does. Verse 4, a wholesome tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in the tongue is a breach of the spirit. Or you could also say breaks the spirit. And this is a kind of, I don't want to get too Joel Osteen, but this is something that is, there's some biblical precedent for this. This idea that what you say out of your mouth greatly impacts your life. It could impact whether improving or being a detriment to your spirit, your soul. When you say things like, I'm never going to find somebody to love me, or I'm never going to get a better job, or I'm always going to be poor. That sort of thing, I mean, there is something to that impacts your body. Dr. Carolyn Leaf, who is a psychophysiologist, she examined this through runners, people that ran track. And she said that if you interviewed people that were running in a race before the race and asked them what position they felt like they would come in before the race, the people who would say something more rational or believable, they'd say, well, I'll probably come in second or third. Those people would usually come in whatever position that they believed that they could come in. But the people who either said, I'm going to win or I'm going to lose, they would do one of those things. They would either come in first or last. And so What she said was there's something in our bodies that when we say, I'm going to win, it prepares to give everything. But when you say, I'm going to probably come in second or third, it actually holds some back. And though through that, you are actually giving a self-fulfilling prophecy because you're not going to give everything that you could, and you'll come in second or third because you didn't devote all of yourself. So your words do have an impact on what happens in your life, whether you understand it or not. It's subconscious in some ways. But that's what this is talking about. Perverseness of the tongue is a breach to the spirit. It'll break your spirit. If you constantly talk about negative things will come back to you. Okay? Now, and we've talked about that in previous chapters. That's not a new concept. Look at verse 3 with me for a moment, because this establishes an important understanding of one of the characteristics of God. Verse 3 says, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. And so I'm going to write this way and then hold it up for you. The eyes of the Lord are everywhere. What does this mean? Well, this means that God is everywhere at the same time. Let me see if I'm spelling this right. Yeah. So, this is a characteristic of God. Omnipresence. It just means omni, meaning all, presence, present. God is present everywhere. He's present in all places. Okay? In the same way that we would say that God is omniscient, omni, meaning all, scient, science, knowledge. So God has all knowledge. He is omnibenevolent. Omni, meaning all, benevolent, meaning love. He's all loving. God is omnipotent. Omni, meaning all, potent, meaning power. He is all powerful. Some of the alls about God: omnipresence, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent. In this verse, Proverbs 15:3, we do discover this. This is one of the characteristics of God, that He is omnipresent. He's everywhere at the same time. He sees everything. The eyes of the Lord are every place, beholding the evil and the good. This reminds me of that 70s show, of all things. Michael Kelso is trying to convince some of his friends that God is watching them. And one of his friends points out, he says, you have sex before marriage. Do you not think that God is watching you? And he says, no, I do that in my van. God can't see through metal. And I know that's a horrible thing to bring up, but it's so true that a lot of people think that God can't see them in one place or another. But what we know through God's omnipresence, as exemplified in Proverbs 15:3, is that the eyes of the Lord are everywhere. He sees everything. He is everywhere. So this is a very important thing to understand about God. And this is going to come in. I want to look on down to verse 11, because this is very important to understand as a concept about God. Verse 11 says this: Hell and destruction are before the Lord. How much more then are the hearts of the children of men? So this is a dual statement here. Both hell and destruction are in the presence of God, and all of the hearts of the children of men are laid out before God. We find this also in I think 1 Samuel. Man looketh on the outward appearance, but God looketh on the heart. So God looks on our heart, and He's in the presence of hell at the same time. Now this is counter to what a lot of people teach about hell. A lot of ministers teach that hell is the absence of God. It's where God is not present. That's all that's left, is all the things that are not like God. But I don't think that's quite right. I don't think that that's what the Bible leads us to believe about hell. I think hell is a place where God is very present. Or at least hell is a place that's very much in the presence of God in one way or another. If you ever read C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce, he has a very good analogy about how that hell exists. He says that hell is a place that exists in the cracks of the sidewalks in heaven. So that's an interesting way of putting that, and you'll have to read the book to really understand it. But I've got a couple of verses I want to list off here, and then we'll talk about this in depth. Revelation 14 verses 10 and 11 says that they that are tormented in hell are tormented day and night forever in the presence of the Lamb of God, and that the smoke of their torment rises up in His presence forever and ever. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 29 it says, our God is a consuming fire. In Exodus chapter 34, verse 33, it says that Moses had to put on a veil because he had seen the glory of God, at least in part. And when he came down off the mountain, it physically hurt the children of Israel to even look at him. And in Genesis chapter 8, verses 20 and 21, it says that Noah gets off the ark, he makes a sacrifice to God. The sacrifice's smoke rises up, and God smells that smoke, and it's to him a sweet-smelling savor, acceptable to him. Now, why do I put all these things together? If God is present everywhere, and hell is before him, and it says that those that are tormented in hell are tormented forever in the presence of the Lamb, then it would make sense that they are tormented in flames, because Hebrews 12 and verse 29 tells us that God is a consuming fire. They are in his presence, and he is literally consuming them in the flames. And this flame that it consumes them, bursts them into flames, they are burning, and the smell of the smoke rises up before him forever. And then you look at the context of Genesis chapter 8, the sacrifice for sin pleases God. And so this smoke that rises up in his presence, it pleases him, as it is a sacrifice for sin that justly punishes those that have sinned before him. His glory is so intense, so awesome, that to be in the presence of it would literally consume you in flames. Okay? And this is why throughout the Bible, anytime that somebody saw an angelic being of any sort, they were terrified. It's a horrible looking thing because it's so monstrous to us it could kill us in a moment. And this is why that the people were terrified when they saw Moses. Moses, again, remember this, Moses only saw God's back as he walked away. And so when he saw God's back, it impressed upon him this image of the glory of God, and he comes down off the mountain, and the people that are looking at him, this is secondhand, and it still hurts them to look at. They make him put a veil on his face. Okay? So I do believe entirely that they that are tormented in hell are tormented in the presence of God. And you say, well, how is it that God could be there when he's such a good and loving God? Well, by nature, we've talked about this before, by nature of the fact that he loves, he naturally has to hate. We've talked about this when we were going through some of the earlier chapters, how that God's love would lead him also to naturally hate. So his love for righteousness would be in perfect continuity with his presence in hell, because he is seeing righteousness carried out. These are wicked, unrighteous people that deserve to be punished that are being punished in hell. So take that for what you will. We'll move on into verses 16 and 17. These are verses about contentment. Verse 16 says, "Better is little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therewith. Better is the dinner of herbs where love is than a stalled ox and hatred therewith." And these are a couple of really good verses for couples, because you may be going through a hard time, especially right now during this quarantine, where you're dealing with little, maybe your income has gone down, you're not eating like you'd like to, you're not seeing people like you'd like to, not able to go out and shop and do all the things that you'd like to. This is a couple of verses about contentment, and the joy through suffering that contentment can bring. That latter verse, verse 17, "Better is a dinner of herbs with love than a stalled ox and hatred therewith." I mean, this is like John Bon Jovi lyrics right out. You know, we've got each other, and that's a lot for love. You know, and we'll give it a shot. That's enough. So this is a really good verse for couples, that to be together and to love one another is enough, as long as there's love there. It's better than having treasure when love is present. This also speaks to what heaven is going to be like, because when the streets are literally made of gold, you know, if you took that into our vernacular, how valuable is concrete? I mean, you can go buy 50 pounds of it for $7 at a Home Depot. You know, how valuable could it be? So in heaven, how valuable is gold going to be? It's nothing. They make the gates out of pearls. The streets are made out of gold. You know, everything is just elaborately wealthy. There's no need for any sort of wealth. It's valueless now. The only thing that matters is your love of Christ and Christ's love for you and your love for your brethren and sisters. That's all that matters now. Verse 22 admonishes us to listen to wise counsel once again. Let's read that. "Without counsel, purposes are disappointed, but in the multitude of counselors, they're established." You know, when you're reading it, you read back chapter 14, verse 12, "There's a way that seems right to man, but the end of the way is death." And we talked about how that we need counseling. I told you the story about the older woman who couldn't believe that I would say that I still needed counseling. But regardless of your age or your experience or your title or your education, you still need people to counsel you. We all do. I need people that can tell me when I'm doing something incredibly dumb, or when I'm about to make a decision that's just outlandishly stupid. I need people that can tell me, because I'm not seeing it. We all need that. So in the presence of many counselors, these purposes are established, but without counsel, they're disappointed. They fall through. Okay? Look on to verse 28. It says, the heart of the righteous studies to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. Here again is that word pour. That word vomit just comes spilling out. You can't stop it. But it says the heart of the righteous studies to answer. This admonishes us to study to find the right answer. And this is something that we see again in the New Testament, 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15. Study to show yourself approved, for a workman. A workman does not need to be ashamed, because he rightly divides the word of truth. You take the word and you study it and you learn and you become a wiser person because of it. And this is what Jesus condemns and reprimands the religious people in his day for. In Matthew 22:29, he says, you're in error because you don't know the scriptures nor the power of God. You've not studied this. You've not learned. You've not pored over this scripture. You instead pour words out of your mouth aimlessly and foolishly. So we need to spend time reading the word. And we've talked about commitment to memorization and things like that, having a reading plan. This is all very important. Verse 29 is an interesting verse because it tells us about God's relationship to humans. It says that the Lord is far from the wicked, but he hears the prayer of the righteous. And immediately when I read this, I thought of Lamentations chapter 3 and verse 8, where Jeremiah writes, and he says, I cry out before the Lord day and night, but he shuts out my prayer. He shuts out my prayer. And this is the state of mankind when we're found in Isaiah chapter 59. It says that he looked down and saw that there was no intercessor, and he wondered why that there was no man. So he himself stepped in to save us with his robe of vengeance and his righteousness as armor. He stepped in to save us, and that's Christ. Of course, we know that. John chapter 1, the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst men. And we know these things. So Christ came to be our intercessor because we could not talk to God. I believe it's the book of Malachi. I may be wrong about that. One of the what we call the lesser prophets talks about how that God's eyes are too... It's Habakkuk. Habakkuk talks about how that God's eyes are too holy to look on sin. So he couldn't even talk to us. He couldn't hear our prayer because we were so unrighteous it would be lifting up filthy rags, as Isaiah said. Pus-filled rags. So God is far from the wicked, but he is close to the righteous. He hears their prayers. And so we should constantly be trying to live a righteous life, but also trusting in the faithfulness and the righteousness of Christ to serve as our intercessor, because we could not go to God. Or even praying that God would save us would be worthless in our unrighteousness. We needed Christ to be our intercessor before the Father. And finally, in verse 33, we echo the chief principle of the entire book here. Verse 33, the fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. Now notice this is a little bit different in its verbiage, its phraseology. The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom. So to even begin to learn wisdom, you have to have the fear of the Lord. It's, again, as we've talked about several times in previous passages, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It's what you must have as a predication to even begin acquiring wisdom. It cannot be gained afterwards. So this is a brief run-through of Proverbs chapter 15. I thank you for listening. I hope that you're gaining something. Leave a comment below. Share this video with your friends. I'm Pastor Michael Shultz, and be blessed.